Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right. Preventing green movements from contradicting their future actions and aim is what's our case for today. With that being said, let me voice my opinion as the Prime Minister of the government's team on today's ongoing motion that this House believes that green movements should completely reject all support from oil and gas companies. All right. First of all, I would like to present the speak case for today's motion. I myself, as the Prime Minister, will be defining the motion and also present my first substantive, while my Deputy Prime Minister will be providing her own substantive and also rebutting the points coming from the opposition's team. On the other hand, my whip will be summarizing this motion as a whole and also rebutting the points coming from the opposition team as well. First and foremost, let me present my status quo for today's motion. These gas and oil companies has actually been there are two types of discourse to secure the interests. First, they discredit and marginalize these ecological issues that's been going on around. And as an example of actions taken by the oil and gas companies against climate policies, such as in Seattle, Washington, where they hire lobbyists to ruin this to torpedo pro-environmental policies adopted by the city. All right. With that being said, let me first define what does it mean by the term green movements. So green movement is basically a diverse scientific, social, scientific or social or political movement that broadly addresses the concerns of environmentalism. And by the term completely rejecting, we mean that we are totally refusing to accept this kind of usage and support from these oil and gas companies. All right. Now I'll move on to my first substantive under the key phrase, wrecking our climate. What I mean by this is that we know that these oil and gas companies are basically fossil fuels industries. And when we are talking about fossil fuel industries, the first thing that comes up to our mind is that how detrimental it is to our environment these days. It's been clearly said in various researches that these kind of companies are only going to worsen the impact of the climate crisis that's been going on around. So I think that this purpose of this perspective of oil and gas companies are actually not meeting up with the main purpose of green movement. As I said earlier in my definition, green movement is basically an action taken to broadly address the concern about the environment, right? But then the oil industries are actually causing detrimental issues to the environment. So how does this refer to each other? I don't think it actually supports what does it mean by the term green movement, right? Okay, green movements are obviously efforts to trying to make the environment much more better and to minimize pollutions that has been destructing the Earth's natural habitat, right? So let's say we do allow these green movements to support these oil and gas industries. But what is going to happen if we support these kind of companies? It is actually going to worsen the quality of life of the habitat or as human beings in this world. So what I'm trying to say is that these oil and gas industries are the main reason for global warming, issues such as global warming to occur. As I said in my status quo, these kind of industries are only focusing on how to improve their economical state in terms of providing oil and gas to the country. But then we are actually focusing on, that's why we are saying that it is not, green movement should not support these kind of countries, because as I said before, green movement focuses on improving the environment, not actually focusing on the economic state of the country. So there might be a questions on what are other alternatives that we can take as an alternative to avoid these kind of issues, and from completely removing and rejecting this kind of industries that the green movements are actually trying to support. So I think that an easy alternative for this is that transitioning to using 100% of renewable energy. By this, I think there are high possibilities and high chances for the environment to actually improve, because we know that renewable energies are far much better than non-renewable energies, as I said before, oil and gas industries. So this actually proves that these are the efforts that we can take, and these are the terms that are actually meeting the main purpose of green movements, while on the other hand, the gas and oil industries are not actually meeting with the main purpose of these green movement. So this is actually, I'm sorry, let me provide an example for these issues. Basically, supporting to the transition, moving or transitioning to renewable energy sources like Greenpeace, that's actually was created recently, is actually focusing on reducing dependence on fossil fuels and promoting clearer alternatives in order to actually improve the economic state as well, but also focusing on these kind of green movements. So I think that this is why we are actually not trying, we actually believe that green movement should not support these kind of industries, or specifically from oil and gas companies, because as I said before, it's actually focusing on the economic state, and it's actually not meeting with the terms or meeting with the main purpose of green movements, rather than using a renewable source that is actually meeting with the purpose that, as I said before. So that is why I've never been prouder to propose that green movements should completely reject all support from oil and gas companies. Thank you.
All right, I bet the speaker for the fine speech. Now to invite the leader of opposition.
Just give me a minute. And am I audible?
You're loud and clear, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think I'll be unable to turn on the video. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's important to understand that in the ever-changing world where green movements are becoming more and more relevant things, even though as of now, they are not as relevant things as, say, completely being able to banish or ban oil companies, we believe that the relevance of green movements is slowly increasing, not at a pace that's enough to, say, solve climate change, but at least at a pace that we can at least know and see the impact that it has made in oil companies and climate change stuff alike, right? It is more and more evident that oil companies are trying to find an alternative to invest in, so that the money that they are making and the money that they have made can actually keep generating, right? And in the long term, they probably are going to get some form of money as well. What we don't get on the side proposition is exactly that. And they're constantly telling us that their interests don't align, but we tell you that it does. And I'll explain in my speech why. But before that, 3 questions I'll answer in my speech. First, why does green movement not rejecting all support from what does green movements not rejecting all support from oil companies look like? Secondly, why is it better than rejecting it? And thirdly, what are its benefits? But before that, some rebuttals. The entire case of side proposition lines around the fact that the purpose of oil company and the purpose of, say, green movements don't align together, because one, first of all, oil companies probably want to make profit. They make profit by selling oil in the status quo, and the and the interest, or say the purpose of green movements is to bring positive changes to improve the quality of life. However, oil companies worsens it, and green movements focus on the improvement aspect of it, right? As I've already told you, the problem with this particular argument is the very sheer assumption, and a very astonishing assumption, that green movements are so weak and they are not gaining traction at all to force these oil companies to actually align with these green movements in order to make some form of reparation, or say to at least continue the profit that they already are making, right? And I'll further explain this down in my speech as well. But for now, let's just understand that the reason why their purpose align is because there is a change being pushed and there is resistance that exists, right? Resistance is probably the already existing oil resources and the big players of oil resources, right? However, as this resistance increases more and more, we believe that these big players in oil industry are likely to want to change, and that's why the interest of green movements and, say, oil companies align, right? Because at the point of time they're unable to do so, they lose funding, and then they probably don't want that, because they want to keep the investors happy. They want to keep generating money for all the infrastructures that they have invested in, right? Now let's move on to some context. First of all, we believe that green movements are movements that care for the environment and need to lead the advocacy and innovation for climate change, right? That is to say, yes, many green movements exist, but as a collective force, they likely want to bring some form of change in the status quo, advocate for the sake of climate change, and also to innovate and bring innovations that are not accessible to everyday individuals because of a lot of barriers that I'll talk about later, right? But secondly, we believe that the world is still very heavily dependent on oil, and it's nearly impossible to replace it. Just think about your jacket, right? It's made up of polyester. That's literally petroleum product. Vaseline is petroleum product. It's not just, say, oil only, right? A lot of crude products that we extract from oil as well. All of these things as well contribute. But even if we were to say that it's just oil and nothing else, nothing, no byproduct, we believe that there's still a huge dependency on this oil, right? Because the entire source of energy in the vast majority of instances for electricity generation, say for your vehicles, right? Because electric cars are so much more expensive. In all of those instances, we are heavily dependent on oil, and we can't move on without
Um,
Let me see what's up.
yeah, okay.
Am I audible?
You are now.
Okay, where was I?
Something I heard about connection,
Um, okay.
but yeah, but you stop at 4:10.
Oh, 10. All right. Okay. So I'll start again in 3, 2, 1. We believe that it's very important to understand that the world is still very heavily dependent on oil. The world is still very heavily dependent on petroleum products such as polyester, such as Vaseline, and all those stuff, and even oil in of itself to generate the vast majority, in vast majority of instances, a lot of energy that the world is producing, right? And because of all those reasons, it's still very hard to bring any sort of change in the oil industry, because we are just so very dependent on it, right? So we believe that alternative is also extremely expensive, right? If you are going for natural materials or eco-friendly materials, it probably means that there's some form of luxury associated with it, and also some form of hard complexity in manufacturing process in of itself, compared to cheap oil products that essentially end up increasing the cost, right? Which makes it inaccessible to the vast majority of people, or they just don't care about it or don't want to invest more, because climate change is an issue that's going to impact them, right? Say you're sitting under the AC, then you probably don't care about climate change, and you're going to use oil products regardless of whether or not it causes climate change. Also, it's important to understand that whatever, regardless of what we do, climate change is not going to stop, right? That is to say that even in our even in the best case scenario, the earth is still going to be warm for like the next 70 years or so, because industrial revolution caused the most damage. There are a lot of factors that have already gone out of control. The ozone layer is depleting, the greenhouse gases are slowly increasing, and because of all those reasons, we believe that significant improvement is hard to see. So why can't there be other avenues of funding? We believe that USA and all major superpowers are interested to actually in the oil business itself, right? They have invested trillions of dollars in this business, so they probably don't want the transition to be as smoothly, or they probably don't want to invest a large sum of money in, say, innovations that fight climate change, right? Because they have already invested a large sum of money in oil. But secondly, we also believe that you are the other funder, because most people don't care about climate change, because they don't face the utilitarian harm when rivers in Pakistan may be drying, but you're staying under the AC and enjoying your life, right? So we believe that is also a thing to consider. What is our argument? Our argument is that we cater to innovations uniquely, because we say that oil money has a lot of money, right? That is to say, companies like, say, oil companies in Saudi Arabia or in many other places have a ton of money, and this money is exclusively with them. And when they have this money, they have the reason and the incentive to invest, right? The reason why this is true is because other actors don't have the incentive enough to fund these kind of corporations. However, the incentive that these oil corporations have is a matter of fact that they have a lot of stake in the oil business, and they probably want to cater to the change in of itself. And because of all those reasons, we believe that we win this debate. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
You're loud and clear, the floor is yours.
Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'll first be starting off with some rebuttal. So the leader of opposition stated on how we are dependent on oil and can't live without the oil and gas industry, and how the main source of energy is oil. However, I'd just like to highlight that there are like the prime minister, like I'm sorry, like the leader of opposition has stated in his speech, there are various innovations that these green movements are advocating to be created, so that we can slowly switch from oil and gas as our main source of energy to more low carbon to a more low carbon solution. And so it is not, I think that it is not relevant to say that we are truly dependent on the oil industry and we cannot live without it, because even as we're speaking right now, various innovations have already existed to replace the products made from oil and gas as a more low carbon and pollution free solution. And then the leader of opposition also stated about how resistance from these green movements are going to make this oil and gas industry is going to want to change. However, I don't see how this could happen, because like the leader of opposition already said himself, they have already invested trillions of dollars in this oil and gas industry. So what makes you think that they are going to want to change they're going to want to change their ways of extracting oil and gas as they've already invested trillions of dollars and are already profiting a lot from it. So like the leader of opposition stated, a more low carbon solutions would be more expensive, like the leader of opposition stated in his speech. So what makes you think that simple resistance from green movements are going to make the oil and gas organizations want to change? So I'll move on to my substantives now on how on how accepting support from oil and gas companies would be undermining and disrespectful to the purpose and efforts of green movements. So it would technically be contradictory for green movements to accept support from any kind of support from oil and gas companies. It would be contradictory to their whole purpose of being for the environment and being against pollution by accepting support from the most significant contributor towards pollution. And considering the fact that oil and gas is basically the most it's basically like the biggest enemy of the environment right now, and most green movements existing today they exist just to go against oil and gas industries. So any green movement accepting support from these companies would not just undermine the purpose and efforts of not just the movement that is accepting the support, but also all green movements in general. So let me give you an analogy for this. For example, I'll give you an example for this. If an ocean conservation movement accepts support from an oil and gas company, which is the reason why these movements exist in the first place, and I'm talking about this in a negative sense and not in a positive way. In a way that oil and gas industries damage the oceans the most, and these movements exist to advocate to protect these oceans from these damages. So if they accept support from these companies, so what are they advocating for? Because these oil and gas industries are not going to change their ways of extracting the oil and
Eli?
already damaging the ocean. Just yes. I'm sorry.
It is true that you might be truer to your goal, but how do you change the industry on your side?
How do I change the industry on my aspect? So the leader of opposition did address about this a bit in his speech. So green movements are pushing for innovations to encourage the society to switch to more low carbon solutions. So I think this would be somehow a way for us to change the industries in his aspect. Right. So going back to my speech. So I'll repeat from I'm sorry. So these oil and gas industries are the reason why these ocean conservation movements exist in the first place. So in a way that oil and gas industries damage the oceans the most, and these movements are advocating to protect the oceans from these damages oil and gas industries are causing. So if they're accepting support from these companies, so what are they advocating for? Isn't that just against their whole purpose of being there? So I like to conclude my substantive by saying how it is more sensible for green movements to not accept support from oil and gas companies as to stay true and respectful to their purpose of existence. So moving on to my second substantive about how accepting support from oil and gas companies will prevent green movements from reaching their lateral goal. So by accepting support from oil and gas companies, so our goals of reaching and creating a world free from pollution are not going to be reached. So to explain this substantive, let's look back on why we want a world free from pollution. So it is all going to relate back to us humans. So as polluted world leads to many problems involving humans, like the main concern right now, which is health problems, and there's also going to be financial problems. There's also going to be financial problems in the sense that most oil and gas industries, as oil and gas industries run on unrenewable energy sources, and eventually these resources are going to run out, and there's going to be lack of resources, and that's going to create financial problems. And then there's also going to be social problems. For example, invasion of human settlements and populations, just so these industries could expand its businesses. So also I would like to highlight about how support from these oil and gas companies are actually a way for these companies to shift public attention from their unacceptable activities and rebrand themselves into a more greener company. So let's talk about so I'd like to conclude my speech by saying it is irrelevant for movements to accept for green movements to accept these donations, as it will not contribute any way in reaching the goals of creating a pollution-free world. So with that, I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Right, just making sure I can be seen and heard.
Yep, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Right, thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sudal. I'm going to be second speaker from opposition. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and I would like POIs verbally, please. I'm sorry. Give me a second. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. When islands in Maldives and people in Maldives are facing crises where they're losing their homes and places where they grew up in because a oil company burnt fuel, side proposition wants to build a world where all they do is try to go on a futile and rampant protest against large multi-billion-dollar industries where they give us no mechanism for change. We think that this is just a very, very radical approach that does not address the true issue at hand. Side opposition today, and me in my speech particularly, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to show you why it is very, very difficult to make the radical policies that proposition wants to make. But secondly, I would also like to mechanize the argument of why innovation is the only way to solve climate change issues and how our side is the only side that is uniquely able to give you innovation at a greater scale. Firstly, then, context clarification. Why is it difficult to make radical policies, and why is it radical policies? Why are radical policies that are the only policies that probably only work from side proposition? The context here is that in order for any sort of policies to make a real impact, you need collective radical action. What does this mean? This means if out of us, like let's say 50 states in a country, if 20 states agree that we're going to stop using carbon, but 30 states are like, oh no, we're still going to use carbon, the impact of those 20 states not using carbon is going to be mitigated very, very greatly. Which is to say that for us to have any sort of great impact on minimizing the rate of climate change and minimizing the harms that we're facing in the status quo, we need collective radical action. There are a few barriers to this. I'm going to give you 2 points here. Firstly, on why humans are creatures that largely focus on proximal harms and benefits. The context here is that the United States made, I don't know, hundreds of billions of dollars, I think somewhere around $300 billion in 2022 alone from the oil industry. This gives you an idea of how large of a dependency the entire population has on oil, which is to say that people, when they have to give up things like their cars, give up things like Vaseline, which they want, when they need to give up a lot of these things, which is going to significantly reduce their quality of life, they are not ready to do so because this is something that is of proximal harm to them. They do not see that islands are being submerged in Maldives. So the people in the US are less likely to give into this collective action, and this creates what we call a collective action problem, hereby not allowing us to solve the issue. The second problem, however, is lobbyist companies and how governments are going to be reluctant to make radical policies. Because once a company makes $300 billion for your economy, even if green movements are not concerned with the economy, the government surely is concerned with the economy. What this means is that they are less likely to go against the agenda of these large companies, and they have a lot of leverage over politicians in terms of money, in terms of the economy and finances. We clearly see why there's going to be substantial momentum against radical policies. Before I move on to my argument, are there any questions? Seeing none, I'm going to move on to my argument. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about how the government are focusing more on the economic. So what is actually the function of increasing in economy if our environment itself is being contaminated and the ice in Antarctica is already being melted down? How can the economic increase help with that?
Right. The thing is, even if you protest against those companies, my point was not that they're going to solve climate change through economic development. What I said was even if you are able to push for radical reform, it is unlikely that you're going to get that reform because these companies are very, very big players in the government. That's all I was saying. All right, then. My argument is titled Innovation is the Only Way to Solve Climate Change Issues. 4 points of context to this argument. Firstly, why is it impossible to reach Holocene, i.e. the original Earth state? Even if we solve all or stopped all of the carbon emissions and every pollution that we do in the status quo, the scientific fact is that it is very, very difficult for us to go back to the original Earth. This is because we have basically melted a lot of icebergs. We have emitted so much greenhouse gases that even if we stop emission today, the effects of that are going to haunt us for a lot of decades to come, which is to say that we might solve what we call global boiling, but global warming is still largely going to be an issue because all of that carbon we emitted is still going to be in the atmosphere, is still going to be affecting us. Therefore, just solving like greenhouse gas emission is something that is not enough of a solution to solve all of the problems that we're facing in the status quo. Second point of context is again funding. And here I want to give you two pieces of subcontext, right? Firstly, even if we do agree that innovation is symmetric, what is not symmetric is the rate of innovation and the scale of innovation. Now, the reason innovation is very, very important and the scale of innovation is very, very important is that climate change is a very, very pressing and urgent issue. Every decade we don't solve this, with a lot, like thousands of peoples are probably losing their habitat. Many lives are being lost due to things like floods, right? This is very, very urgent. Therefore, any sort of change that we're able to get on the scale and any sort of magnification that we're able to get in the context of scale is something that reaps massive benefits then. Therefore, what are probably the sources for this funding then? Number one, probably governments. But I think I've already given you enough analysis on proximal benefits, but also lobbying as to why governments are not likely to fund this to very, very great degrees. But secondly, probably NGOs and INGOs. So, but the main context here is that the funding that comes from these oil companies is very, very large in amount and is very, very significant. A 350 billion-dollar industry probably giving us even 1% of their entire market is like $35 billion, right? That's a very, very great amount. It's like $3 billion. So what we're able to do with that amount of money is something that impacts us very, very greatly. So what is our mechanism to this argument? 2 points. Firstly, when we're able to use the funding for research and development, we are going to be able to solve our problems. Actually, this is the only hope we have, given my earlier analysis of how it is really impossible to solve this problem otherwise. Second piece of mechanism, when we have billions of dollars of funding, we're able to mitigate most of the harms of the oil industry. What this means is that the oil industry is also now going to have an incentive structure in order to keep funding us more. Because if we, through research and development, are able to create technologies that allow us to mitigate the harm of gas and oil industry, it is going to create an environment where both of the industries are going to be able to thrive well together. What are the impacts of this? 3 points. Firstly, we're going to have a boosted rate of research and development, which is going to allow us to access all of the change. This is independent from their side because research and development just doesn't have enough money. Second impact on more global cooperation because we are not going against large multi-billion dollars companies anymore. Third impact on how anti-green propaganda is reduced because these large companies are largely responsible for creating public sentiment against climate change movements. In conclusion, since the main goal of green movements is to solve climate change issues like global warming, we are the only side that is able to reach disincentive. Vote opposition.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To conclude the case from side government, I'd like to invite the government with.
Can you hear me?
You're loud and clear, of course, yours.
Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the green movement helps the environment by reducing the amount of pollution that enters the soil, water, and air by using an alternative energy sources and avoiding the burning of fossil fuel to ensure fewer pollution are released into the environment. So with that, we as the government side, we have never been prouded to stand with this motion, which is this house believe that green movement should completely reject all support from oil and gas company. Okay, so moving on. The opposition side has mentioned about how we as the government side keep talking about oil and gas company actually only giving out oil, but the company actually make a lot of our basic daily life necessities such as plastic and polyester. But that's actually clash with our point that it is actually can about wrecking our climate because as we know, plastic and polyester is not sustainable enough because it contribute to greenhouse gas emission and it generate a massive amount of plastic waste, a great amount of plastic waste that can be up to 100 of years to even dispose one single plastic. Next. We as a government side, we do concede the fact that money is important for our nation, to build our nation, to create more technology for the greater of our nation. But do money is yet to be useful when our whole world is actually already being contaminated, when it's actually at the most critical state already? Why are we only thinking about the money? Why not thinking about the future of our generation? Yes, the opposition is right. We cannot stop climate change, but the least that we can do is, even if we cannot stop the climate change, the least that we can do is to minimal the impact on the climate change, to slower the rate of the climate change from destroying the earth that we live in. How are you actually going, let's take an example, how are you actually going to live in your house if your house is actually full of trashes around everywhere? So yes, you can use up your money to clean it up, but it will actually keep going around and around. Okay, so the opposition side also mentioned that our alternative sources is expensive, such as hybrid car. Yes, we don't deny that hybrid car is expensive, but why don't start with the cheaper example, like the usage of reusable bag instead of a plastic bag created by the oil and gas company? You are only, the government side or I'm sorry, the opposition side are only focusing on the expensive side of an alternative, while even switching off the light before going out in your room can also be called a cheap alternative to actually help creating a better future. The opposition side also mentioned that by receiving money, by receiving support from the oil and gas company, can actually, the money can actually be kept generating, can be kept generating, I'm sorry. But yes, it is true, but where is the green movement dignity if you actually receive money from a company or from a institution that actually causes more of a pollution? Like my Deputy Prime Minister's example earlier about the ocean green movement that actually want to protect the ocean. Imagine if the ocean green movement took support from an oil and gas company which is actually digging deeper into the ocean, ruining the habitat of the of many sea creatures and even our own habitat as the people that we live in. The opposition side also mentioned that right now we cannot actually focusing more on the climate change because we cannot stop it, and that many life has lost their habitat, but the opposition side failed to mention how actually, what are you going to do with the fact that many life lost their habitat due to the climate change? And we as the government, we are actually focusing more on the future because as I said earlier, we do concede the fact that money is important for our future, but which one is more important, money or our living space? What's the point of having a lot of money if we can't buy a new planet with the money? So why not focus more on why not focusing more on slower the rate of the climate change instead of actually just collecting up money and speed up the rate of climate change? And I'm also going to mention that the opposition side are mostly focusing on the economic state and the economic state of the nation and not actually how it's going to impact on a long-term situation. And the opposition side has said in their mechanism that we are actually able to create technology to improve the effect and bring benefit to both sides using the fund. But we do have to realize that the amount of impact to the environment is just too large, that just by creating a technology, as you say, is not going to fully improve the environment. And just imagine how many product we need to make before we can actually create a good technology. How many ways have we done before we can create one technology that is actually functioning good for the for the society? And with that, me as the government whip have never been prouder to stand with this motion. Thank you.
All right, I bet the speaker for the fine speech. Now, to conclude the case for opposition, I'd like to invite the up whip.
Sorry. Yeah. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in my speech, I'll be doing a few things. Number one, telling you as to why the arguments of side proposition clearly doesn't work. Secondly, whatever they try to achieve is not something that comes through their mechanisms. And thirdly, a lot of comparatives on why our side does things better for climate and for these green movements, right? Firstly, we think that there's a missing link or missing mechanism as to what happens on side proposition. How do these movements get funding, or how are these movements trying to fight against people who don't believe the idea of climate change, or how are they lobbying people on their side to make change and minimize the harms, right? They do try to focus on saying that the best way to solve this is by minimizing the impact, but we don't get as to what is really happening on their side, right? So what we tell you is that on their side, the likely case is probably that these green movements try to protest against these, let's say, oil companies, or say that, okay, these values are not something we should go for, and maybe try to like put a lot of emphasis on like not supporting them, right? But as my speakers previously have already told you, firstly, because of the fact that a lot of people probably don't care so much about climate change, because oil and gas industry is largely related to their everyday lives, everyday things that they use, they'll be quite reluctant to support the movement as a whole, because it is a very big step that they're taking in proposition, right? And secondly, we tell you that when there's governments that have been supported by oil and gas industries for such a long time, and it's to a crazy and immense amount that they're being supported and funded by these oil gas companies and have partnered with these oil gas companies, it becomes significantly difficult for proposition to emphasize how is collectively, or how is on their side, people are going to come collectively together, or governments are going to come collectively together to fight climate change, or in order to support the fact that oil and gas industries are not necessarily good for the environment, right? We think because this exists among people or average people, and secondly, because it exists in big authoritarian things like the government, we think it becomes very difficult for side proposition to justify how are they going to solve things, right? But what do we tell you is that if you look at the actors who can possibly fund green movements, because the best way about it is to go for innovation, and I'll be weighing it in my comparative why that is true, we tell you that actors like government probably have other incentives and are heavily partnered with these oil and gas companies like the states of US or other countries like that. Therefore, it becomes difficult for them to not, sort of get a lot of funding from this. And we also tell you that things like other organizations simply don't have enough fund to support the type of innovation these sorts of companies are trying to foster, right? So we think that possibly the best actor in this could be the oil and gas companies. A few response to what the government whip says, right? The reason why this actor is probably the best is also because on their side, what happens is when you don't hold these companies responsible, you allow them to do more and more to harm the environment. But at least on our side, what we're able to do is that these companies who have caused harm to the environment are able to themselves get responsible or themselves get involved in the process of minimizing the harm, right? We think principally too, it becomes their responsibility and it is justified for them to actually be responsible for the harms that they create on our side. Whereas what happens on their side is that these companies are not, number one, able to get shut down or able to minimize their impact because governments and people are reluctant. And secondly, the fact that these companies probably will continue to aggravate more and more because there's no mechanism in order to stop this on-site government, right? So what we tell you is that it becomes their responsibility, and therefore involving them in this process is not something that's weighable against the fact that proposition talks about it undermines the values of this movement. We think it's much more greater that the investment that they get is so much important for fostering innovation, right? Side government pushes the idea that, okay, maybe technology is not the best way, we need to minimize the impact. Firstly, no mechanism whatsoever what happens on their side, but what our side tells you is that innovation is probably the best way to go about it, because in today's world, you simply cannot minimize the impacts by shutting these oil companies companies down or trying to advocate against them. You simply can't put down climate change just because you're able to cut off all carbon emissions. We tell you there has been historical effects like industrial revolution or things like that that have already caused permanent harm in the environment, which is likely to be mitigated by the fact that we need to move into innovation and how this can actually be better on side opposition, right? So overall, what you get from side opposition is number one, in terms of context and premise, the fact that climate change is probably something that could be fought through innovation. Secondly, the fact that what these green movements want is probably in the long run to minimize the impacts of climate change and make Earth a better habitat for people. And the main motive they have is to solve and sort of approach this thing. And the best way they can go about it is by fostering innovation, because on side proposition, they clearly do not have enough backup, or they clearly do not have enough capital to sort of raise these sorts of innovation and technology on their side. And secondly, they probably still are going to be resisted by people or the government, because I've already told you as to why people and governments are likely to be reluctant to support this movement, right? So another idea that side government pushes is that purpose of oil companies probably don't like match with the purpose of these environmental movements, and therefore it becomes very difficult, right? We think that just because they receive funding doesn't mean the environmental movements completely start being like, oh, we should support oil companies. We think that is the first understanding that side proposition needs to have. And secondly, we also tell you that these oil companies probably want to also in the long run move into things like technology or science, because they know that if they want their company to foster, they have to be innovative in the long run, and therefore an incentive for them to be able to innovate and sustain in the long run also exists, right? So we told you that this is important because these companies probably want to fund more and more to ensure that their company is able to receive the technology or funding in order to make oil practices or gas practices sustainable in the long run, right? Because you can't deny the fact that if this profitable industry becomes like innovative or becomes or is minimized, the harm is minimized because of the fact that some sort of technology exists, these companies will be always looking forward to opt into these measures, because they also understand that the way these oil companies are facing backlash is immense, and therefore it becomes important for them to also move into sustainable practices, right? And thirdly, we also tell you is that because of the fact that these green movements probably are not that weak, getting more relevant in the current status quo, they hold some sort of leverage against these companies and are able to advocate against something that these companies still do, because they are still able to ensure check and balance by using public backlash as a medium for the oil companies to stay in check and balance, right? So we overall think that on side opposition, we're able to solve things better by fostering innovation, which is probably the best way to go about their best interest, that is climate change. Whereas on side proposition, because of no proper mechanism, we really do not understand how are they achieving their goal. Thank you. Proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To summarize the case from opposition, I'd like to invite the opposition reply.
I'll start time. Just a minute. Yeah, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. At the end of the debate, the question becomes, do you want a green movement with a purpose that side proposition hasn't mechanized at all, but no money? Or do you want side opposition where green movements do have money, and maybe, just maybe, their purpose of, say, not aligning with oil companies at the side proposition points it out, even though they lack major logic links, we still, if we were to buy it, do you want a green movement that has a purpose but absolutely no money whatsoever, or much more little money compared to our side of South? We believe that we probably want a green movement where you have money and you also have some sort of cause in actually improving the environment, right? The burden of this motion for us is to prove that we won't completely reject all support from oil and gas corporations, right? It is not to prove whether or not, say, these kind of oil and gas corporations are the ones who are going to be leading the change. We tell you that okay, yes, oil companies do pollute the environment, they do cause a lot of issue. We told you throughout the debate again and again. However, what we get from side proposition is okay, but the interest of the oil companies don't really align with the interest of green movements that aim to improve the lives of individuals and whatnot, right? But the biggest issue with their argument is okay, they point out a flaw and that's fair, but where is the counter analysis, right? That is to say, how are they going to get funding? How are they going to get at least adequate funding? Even if we were to say that they are going to get funding by some other means or avenue, we don't get that mech. And secondly, they also point out how their interests are opposite. First of all, they don't point out the harm of it. And secondly, even if we were to believe that their interests are opposite, we believe that in the vast majority of instances, we constantly told you throughout our speech and throughout our bench that okay, the interest may be differing, but as green movements slowly gain more and more traction, these oil companies are probably wanting to invest more and more in these green technologies so that they don't miss out on the profit that they make out of it, right? And the reason why we say that is because it's very, very important to innovate, right? We have told you that again and again in our speeches as well. We have told you that green products, especially currently, are extremely expensive. They're very inaccessible to the vast majority of individuals, and that we are so incredibly dependent on oil products. And that's why it's very essential that we get adequate money for innovation. We don't see how that happens inside proposition. They have absolutely no any counterfactual at all in that regard, right? What we told you was because these companies, which are oil companies, are companies that probably want some sort of profit from actually getting the money in the green movement. As it slowly gains traction, they probably have an incentive to innovate. They probably have an incentive to invest in, say, an innovative approach, and these social in these green movements that aim to find this innovative approaches to solve, say, climate change and stuff, right? These innovative approaches may look like, say, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel from Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia itself, itself is not, say, a green country, right? Because of these reasons, we believe it's because innovation is just so important, and we can't reverse the harms of what we have done in a very short amount of time. It's probably permanent in many instances. We believe that it becomes extremely essential that to not do any more harm, which is the biggest incentive of green movement, we need a lot of money and we need a lot of innovation. And the only way to achieve lots of innovation is through lots of money. We don't get that inside proposition at all. What we have constantly been telling you throughout our benches is that you are going to get that on our side of the house, because oil companies are just crazy rich and they have the incentive to invest as well. Very proud.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To summarize the case from the government side and also the semi-finals round, I'd like to invite the government the reply.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Right. So I will start my reply by highlighting the case proposed by the opposition side. So the opposition side are actually allowing a world where the oil and gas industries are allowed to aggravate their unacceptable actions of damaging the environment just because they are somehow supporting quote unquote supporting green movements through donations and resources toward these movements. So let's compare that to our case, where in the government side, we actually understand the ulterior motives of these industries, and understanding the fact that their support does not actually mean that they are trying in any way. They are actually there are I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. On the government side, we actually understand the ulterior motives of these industries, and understanding the fact that their support towards green movements does not actually mean that they're taking any significant approach towards switching to a more greener towards working towards a more greener efforts in their industry, and it does not mean that they are supporting green efforts in any way. However, I also like to address a few flaws that the opposition side has provided to us throughout this debate. So the opposition side, they failed to address the greenwashing issue that we have addressed in my speech as a deputy prime minister, and they also do not address how they also do not address about the damage that these oil and gas industries are causing, and the fact that the damage that they are causing actually cancels out any kind of support they are giving towards green movements unless they actually work for good and banish their whole industry as banish their industry as a whole, or actually take any significant approach towards greener efforts. So with that, the opposite with that, the government side rests our case. Thank you.
All right, that concludes the semi-final round. Thank you for the fine speech. Now both teams can virtually cross the floor, shake hands, and obviously semi-final, this is a silent round, so yeah, leave the room for the judges to deliberate.